In 1828, Andrew Jackson had been elected President of the United States, and as Vice President, John C. Calhoun had stayed on, having previously served as Vice President under John Quincy Adams. Now, immediately, there was an issue that arose that caused contention between the President and the Vice President, and it had to do with tariffs. Tariffs, of course, being taxes on goods that are imported from overseas. In 1828, a new tariff had been levied by Congress and signed into law by President Adams, but supported by Andrew Jackson. And essentially, the purpose of this increased tariff was to provide funds for the American system that we talked about, that economic plan that involved massive infrastructure projects, which have to be paid for somewhere, and there was no such thing at this time as an income tax. Now, this new tariff had tariff of up to 50% on some items, particularly wool, that were imported from overseas. Now, the South, many people in the South despised this tariff because, well, the point of the tariff is to raise money. It's also to protect American businesses, right? Because if you add this heavy tax on foreign goods, then they will become much more expensive and people will buy the American. However, in the South, there was not much industry because they had basically put all their eggs into the basket of cotton agriculture. They hadn't been building factories like they had in the North, and that meant they weren't producing the goods that they needed, and so they tended to import a lot more stuff than northern states did. So Southerners believed that this was unfair to them. It was placing a heavier burden on them, and they particularly didn't like the fact that this heavy burden was to fund the American system, infrastructure stuff, because most of that was being done in the North with the building of canals and roads and so forth. So the South was having to pay for something that wasn't benefiting them. So many began to refer to this 1828 tariff as the Tariff of Abominations. So particularly in South Carolina, that's where people were most outspoken against it. And John C. Calhoun, Vice President, was from South Carolina. People in South Carolina started talking about the prospect of nullification. Nullification, that's that thing that Thomas Jefferson had introduced back in those Kentucky resolves that were written in opposition to John Adams' Alien and Sedition Acts way back in 1799. The idea that if a state deems a federal law to be unconstitutional, the state can nullify that law or refuse to recognize it. Now, this would put the state equal or above the authority of the national government, right? Because the idea is, in a federal system, you have a state government and a national government, and the state government is responsible for some things, but must defer on other things to the national government. So not only were they talking about nullification, there was even beginning to be some talk about even secession, that if the national government tried to force the issue on these tariffs, South Carolina would secede, would withdraw from the Union and become essentially their own independent state. Well, this is a major crisis. Daniel Webster, senator from Massachusetts, one of the triumvirate, one of the big three senators of the early 19th century, along with Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun, he denounced this idea of nullification on the floor of the Senate, referring to it as treason. And at the conclusion of his speech, he said quite vigorously, "Liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." Remember when the United States was formed, that first document before the Constitution, the Articles of Confederation and Perpetual Union. The argument being perpetual union means once you join it, you're part of it and cannot be separated from it. Now, Andrew Jackson, like I said, sometimes he seemed to support states' rights, sometimes he seemed to support national rights. On this case, the protection of the Union, he felt very strongly. Now remember, even though he was quite young, he had fought in the American Revolution to establish this Union. He felt, like I said, very strongly about it. And at another one of those cocktail parties in Washington, it was customary for the president to open with a toast and for the vice president to follow with a second toast. So Andrew Jackson's toast was, "Our federal union, it must be preserved." So Calhoun followed that up, kind of in a sneaky way. He said, "To the Union, next to our liberty, most dear." So in other words, he's giving a toast to the Union, but he is kind of in a roundabout way pointing out the Union is actually the second most important thing, not the most important thing. The most important thing is our liberty. And of course, everyone knew he was talking about states' liberty and states' rights. Now, in the middle of this controversy, something else came up, and it had to do with gossip. Gossip in Washington. It became known as the Petticoat Affair, and it involved the wife of the vice president, Fluoride Calhoun, and centered around Peggy Eaton, who was the wife of John Eaton, who was Andrew Jackson's Secretary of War and very close friend. Now, the situation with Peggy Eaton, she was the daughter of a tavern owner, and she had gotten married, and her husband had been a sailor, and he had been reported lost at sea on the other side of the globe, swept overboard, and then not recovered. And that had been some time ago, some years ago. And then she met John Eaton, Andrew Jackson's friend, and they fell in love and got married. And then, not unlike the plot of the Tom Hanks movie Castaway, her long lost at sea husband showed back up. Turned out he hadn't died after all. So this presents some problems, and so that marriage had to be ended officially in order for the new one to be official. And if this sounds familiar, it's because it's the same sort of thing we were just talking about with Andrew Jackson's wife. So Andrew Jackson felt great sympathy for Peggy Eaton because, much like Rachel Jackson, she was the object of much controversy and scandal and condescending remarks. People were talking about how she was a tavern wench, that she was a bigamist, that she was a tramp. And Andrew Jackson was infuriated. Now, the person who was sort of leading the charge in this gossip was Fluoride Calhoun. So Jackson, feeling very protective and defensive of this young woman because it reminded him so much of his own beloved and departed wife, essentially called John C. Calhoun in and told him to get control of his wife, and that didn't work out real well. So that just added an extra layer of tension to the whole situation. Well, let's take a look at what was going on in South Carolina at that time. Now, this is not something new. This has been true since South Carolina was established as a colony. The plantation owners were extremely powerful. Remember, back during the colonial period, South Carolina had been the richest colony, and had the closest thing to an aristocracy, because the original plantation owners, remember, had been the sons of wealthy plantation owners in British colonies in the Caribbean, like Barbados and the Bahamas. So at this time, the plantation owners, still virtually an aristocracy, extraordinarily powerful, even more powerful in South Carolina than plantation owners were in other southern states. Slaves made up 55% of the population. The people of South Carolina were especially fearful of the national government exercising too much power and showing an ability to abridge the rights of states. Okay? Now, the reason for this, the main reason for this, as has been documented by things people were saying at the time, was that South Carolinians believed if the federal government steps in and forces states to do something they don't want to do in one area or in another area, that is a slippery slope that might eventually lead to the national government telling the states they can't have slavery. So they had to protect states' rights because states' rights were necessary to preserve slavery, and slavery, they believed, was necessary to maintain at the proper level, the desirable level of profit, cotton agriculture. Well, South Carolina was essentially making all these claims and threats that they were going to nullify this tariff and maybe even secede. No other southern state or any state was willing to go out on a limb with them and support them in this. In fact, a politician from Georgia, James Petticoat, said famously, quote, "South Carolina is too small to be a nation and too large to be a lunatic asylum." And in the middle of all this, there was a presidential election. Andrew Jackson is running for re-election. This time, the Democratic Party does not choose John C. Calhoun to be his running mate because John C. Calhoun is being quite troublesome. Instead, Martin Van Buren becomes his running mate. Now, the previous few presidential elections had only had really one political party because the Federalists collapsed by 1820. In 1828, there had been a contingent of Democratic Republicans running against Democratic Republican Andrew Jackson that referred to themselves as Adams Republicans or anti-Jackson Republicans. But as of 1830, they came up with an official name and became an official party, the National Republican Party. Now, this is still not the same thing as the modern Republican Party, which wouldn't be formed for another 20 years. But they choose as their candidate Henry Clay to run against Andrew Jackson. Now, another person that was running was William Wirt from Maryland, who was a member of the new Anti-Masonic Party, whose one single campaign issue was they didn't like Freemasons. They believed that Freemasons was a secret elite cult trying to take over the country and control the world, and they didn't trust them. And so that was really all that they talked about. They were the first third party. The first third party. They weren't very big, and they didn't get very far, and they didn't last very long. Now, a fourth person was running, John Floyd. I think he was the governor of South Carolina, or former governor. He was running as an independent, and his sole campaign thing was the right of South Carolina to nullify federal law. So he had a lot of support in South Carolina and virtually no support anywhere else. So the election was held, and Andrew Jackson wins handily. You can see here he gets 54.2% of the popular vote. The rest of it divided among the others. I think that Henry Clay got around 30%. Floyd won South Carolina, but nowhere else. Clay won a few states. Wirt, the Masonic guy, didn't even win Maryland. He did carry in Vermont. So Jackson is going to be staying in office. Martin Van Buren is going to be his vice president, but not immediately. Not until the inauguration, which at that time was in March, 4 months after the election. So John C. Calhoun is still sitting vice president, a lame duck vice president. Now, right after right before the election, Congress had passed a new tariff law, the Tariff Law of 1832, a compromise brokered by Henry Clay that kind of watered down a little bit the thing that had everyone so upset, but South Carolina was still upset. So, after the election, a meeting was held in the capital of South Carolina, basically deciding that the state officially was going to declare nullification of the tariffs of both 1828 and 1832. They were going to refuse to recognize them, and they were still talking about the possibility of secession if that's what it came down to. Recently re-elected President Jackson released a couple of statements about this. He said, "Can anyone of common sense believe the absurdity that a faction of any state or a state has a right to secede and destroy this union and the liberty of our country with it, or nullify laws of the Union? Then indeed is our Constitution a rope of sand. Under such I would not live. The Union must be preserved, and it will now be tested by the support I get by the people. I will die for the Union." On another occasion, he said, "Without union, our independence and liberty would never have been achieved. Without union, they can never be maintained." So, Andrew Jackson, a union man. South Carolina people, for the most part, not union people. In fact, it became a big movement there in South Carolina, and part of it was this fad that arose of people wearing blue cockades or ribbons, kind of like an election ribbon, on their hat. Blue cockade ribbon, shaped like a flower, and in the middle a pin shaped like a palmetto tree. So in other words, the South Carolina flag. And everybody was wearing those to signify their support for nullification and secession if necessary. They're getting all worked up. And President Jackson has made clear these tariffs are going to be enforced. And then he said, "If one drop of blood be shed there," in South Carolina, "in defiance of the laws of the United States, I will hang the first man of them I could get my hands on to the first tree I can find." Now, some of the people assembled there in Charleston sort of had some nervous laughter there. Ha ha ha! Yeah, hey, that's an exaggeration. He wouldn't actually hang somebody, would he? And some people had the foresight to point out when Jackson starts talking about hanging, might as well start looking for a rope, because it's going to happen, right? Because he invaded Florida and hanged people that were visiting in Florida because he didn't like them. Some people might have also pointed out, yeah, a lot of people thought Andrew Jackson won't actually shoot me, will he? But he did. So that got them pretty nervous. They got more nervous when Jackson pushed through Congress. Congress passed and he signed the Force Act that essentially gave the president the authority to personally lead the United States Army into South Carolina and to suppress any hint of rebellion. Now, that's enough to make you nervous if the person in charge of that is Andrew Jackson. So South Carolina kind of backed off, and they're like, well, okay, never mind. And so crisis was averted. The Tariff Act was changed again a little bit to let South Carolina save face, and so then they said, oh, you made this slight change. Well, okay, we'll accept it now. So essentially what had happened is that the Civil War had almost started 30 years early, and Andrew Jackson would have been playing the role of Abraham Lincoln, which is kind of bizarre. All right, well, throughout all this, John C. Calhoun is still officially the vice president, and he resigns as vice president and steps out, and then Van Buren takes over. And Calhoun leaves the Democratic Party and runs for an open Senate seat in South Carolina to return to the Senate. Now, shortly after all of this, a new political party was founded in 1833. They were known as the Whig Party. Has nothing to do with Whigs, by the way. Whigs is the name that was applied to... There were political parties in England, had been for some time, the Tories and the Whigs. The Tories were the royalists who supported the king, and the Whigs were people who were, against the royalists, representing, you could say, the common people. So that's why they took the name the Whigs, because they viewed Andrew Jackson as someone wanting to be a king and acting like he thought he was king, and they're opposing the king, so they call themselves Whigs. The co-founders of this party were Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, the big three, the triumvirate. Now, when the party was formed, then that National Republican Party that had only been around for a couple of years, that dissolved, and all those people became Whigs. The Anti-Masonic Party also dissolved, and those people became Whigs. Some of the Democrats became Whigs. So if you look at these three guys, Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, and Daniel Webster, you will realize that they don't have a whole lot in common so far as their politics. They're at different ranges on the political spectrum. The one thing they have in common is they all hate Andrew Jackson. And Jackson actually lost some popularity as a result of the tariff issue, because more people did start to view him as being a little oppressive toward the states, in their opinion. And by the way, Henry Clay was not a states' rights person. John C. Calhoun was a states' rights person. Henry Clay was a strong national government person. But they hated Andrew Jackson, and that was enough to pull them together into a political party. So I said that they thought of Jackson as a wannabe king, and here's a cartoon from the time describing him as King Andrew the First. So, other people who joined the Whig Party included Congressman Davy Crockett. Congressman Davy Crockett from Tennessee, who had been an ally of Jackson earlier on, but had sort of broken off from him over the issue of Indian removal and the Trail of Tears that we'll be talking about soon. Davy Crockett was opposed to Jackson's plan to forcibly remove the Indians from the South. He thought that was morally wrong, and he stood up against it and lost a lot of support. But he became a Whig. Also becoming a Whig, John Quincy Adams, former President of the United States. Now, Adams had been a Federalist and served as Secretary of State, and then the Federalist Party collapsed, and then he became a Democratic Republican, because that's the only party that was around. Now, there's a third major party, the Whigs, which means that as of this time, he has been in, well, obviously he was also one of those pro-Adams, anti-Jackson national Republicans. So I say here three, actually, so that's four political parties out of five that had existed, the fifth one being kind of a joke, the Anti-Masonic Party. He had been in all four of them. He died in 1848, and just a couple of years later, the modern Republican Party was formed. I have no doubt he would have joined that one too, because it lined up with his politics. Anyway, after leaving the White House in 1829, took a couple of years off, and then he ran for Congress from Massachusetts and was elected to the House of Representatives, where he served for 18 more years. And during that time, he was involved in a lot of activism, particularly opposed to slavery, and his name will come up a couple of more times when we're talking about abolitionism. And I put him, John Quincy Adams, and William Howard Taft, who was president from 1908 to 1912, and then in 1920 became Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. The two of them, plus Jimmy Carter, I think, are the three presidents, 3 one-term presidents, who actually may have accomplished much more after they were president than while they were president. So, the Whig Party. Let's take a closer look at the Whig Party. What were they all about? Well, they supported the American system. That was Henry Clay's idea. They supported modernization, economic development, and internal improvements, infrastructure stuff, roads and canals. That makes sense. They supported the power of Congress over the power of the president. They wanted to see the president's power limited. And that's mainly because the president was Andrew Jackson. They tended to get their support from industrialists and merchants, farmers who lived near waterways. Not farmers who lived away from waterways, but the ones who lived near waterways, because those canals were going to open up opportunities for them to ship their stuff by water. Very wealthy southern planters. So this means they got farmers that live near the river, and they got the really, really, really rich farmers in the south. The other farmers don't support them, okay? So the Whig Party had its greatest strength in the Northeast. So you'll notice a lot of this stuff is similar to the Federalist Party, but not 100%. The Democratic Party, which had previously been the Democratic-Republican Party established by Madison and Jefferson, was alarmed by the growing income gap, income inequality, the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer. That bothered them. They believed that wealthy people who were, quote, non-producers, bankers and merchants who dealt with money but didn't actually work with their hands, were trampling over the rights of people who did work with their hands, workers, factory workers, and farmers. They were in favor of a laissez-faire approach to the economy, the opposite of the Whigs, who, like Federalists, they support the American system, a really strong, active role of the government. The Democrats believe government meddling in the economy will always, always benefit the rich people, never the working class people. So just keep the government out of it. They tended to get their support from factory workers, industrial workers, small farmers, and entrepreneurs. Now think about that. People who owned large businesses favored the Whigs, even as they had previously favored the Federalists. But people who owned small businesses felt like they were being trampled over by the big business, and they felt like the Democrats would rein in the big business. So they supported the Democrats. All right, the next big issue that Andrew Jackson dealt with was the Second National Bank that had been rechartered, if you recall, after the end of the War of 1812. The president of the Second National Bank was Nicholas Biddle of Philadelphia. Very wealthy, from a wealthy and aristocratic background, kind of snobbish. He was in charge of the bank. Clay decided to try to renew this bank 4 years early, in 1832, because he was getting ready to run for president, right, in 1832, so he wanted to draw attention to this. It wasn't really due to 1836. So he's pushing for Congress to renew the bank 4 years early. But he had an obstacle, and that obstacle was President Andrew Jackson. President Andrew Jackson, remember I told you he made a lot of money in land speculation in the 18-teens, and he had helped found Memphis. Actually, the way he did that was that after the First Seminole War, he had actually gone out with a military force to West Tennessee and kind of intimidated and coerced the Chickasaws to sell off all their property on the eastern bank of the Mississippi River, and then they built the city of Memphis there. And so he made a lot of money. And then in 1819, the economy collapsed in the Panic of 1819. And if you recall, a lot of people blamed the National Bank for that, and so did Jackson. So he hated banks. He hated snobs. So he hated Nicholas Biddle. he hated Henry Clay just in general, and therefore he is going to hate the idea of rechartering the National Bank. He criticized its power. It's too much power. It encroaches on states' rights. Now, that may sound odd because previously he had been all about flexing the muscles of the national government with the Tariff Act and not allowing states to get out of hand. But really, part of that, now I think that part of the whole pro-union thing was deeply ingrained in Jackson because of his, his participation in the forming of the Union. But in this case, the states' rights stuff just all came down to the fact that that happened to line up with the goal of getting rid of this bank he hated and sticking it to these people that he hated. So, when the bill to recharter the National Bank goes through, he vetoes that bill, and there's not enough support in Congress to override his veto, and the National Bank is not rechartered. The National Bank dies, and there was never a national bank in that form again. Now, the immediate result of that is that without the National Bank to regulate them, state banks and local banks started overproducing paper money, which is the purpose of having a national bank. And so there was another bubble, and that bubble grew very quickly, and then it burst very quickly in a big way, and immediately led to the Panic of 1837, virtual depression, which was just terrible for the economy and a big blow to the country. And as it turned out for Andrew Jackson, that was like the year he retired and went home because he'd served in his 2 terms. And so that's going to be the next guy's problem. There were, in fact, several years of depression after this. Almost a decade later, when Andrew Jackson lay on his deathbed in Nashville at the Hermitage, he was interviewed, and the person asked him. He said, "Is there anything you feel like you've left undone that you wish you had accomplished?" And his response was that his greatest regret was that I didn't shoot Henry Clay and that I didn't hang John C. Calhoun. He was then asked what his greatest accomplishment was, and he said, I killed that bank.